For 3 days, the emperor's unseeing eyes remained fixed, while flies buzzed at the corners of his mouth. Within the villa's hushed marble corridors, servants moved with the stealth of shadows, each dreading being the one to confirm the ominous scent that permeated the air. Outside, beyond the sheer cliffs of Capri, a sound began, faint at first, like the ocean's murmur against stone, yet growing in clarity with each passing hour. From that growing roar, words coalesced, carrying to the Tiber and Tiberius. The incantation rippled outward from Rome's thoroughfares to every dominion. In death, the man who had instilled terror in millions for 23 years was reduced to his primal state, decaying flesh. The servants discovered him entangled in his bedding, his visage frozen in a final contortion. The afflictions covering his form now wept their last. No lamentations were shed for Tiberius, only relief that the torment had finally ceased. How did a once lauded commander, who had initially spurned absolute authority, devolve into a being so morally bankrupt that the Romans coined new terminology for his transgressions? To comprehend how wickedness donned the imperial robes, we must journey back to a wedding day that commenced with tears. Tiberius pressed his face against the garden's boundary, observing his former spouse with her new husband. In that moment, for the final instance of his existence, witnesses observed him shedding tears. The year was 12 years before the Common Era, and Rome's most promising general had just lost the solitary individual who had ever truly cherished him. Vipsania had not desired the dissolution of their union, nor had Tiberius. However, Augustus decreed it, and when the first emperor commanded, even affection was compelled to perish. His marriage to Vipsania had served as Tiberius's tether to his humanity. She understood his reticence, his preference for military encampments over the opulence of imperial residences. Together, they had cultivated something rare among Roman aristocracy, genuine tenderness. Their son, Drusus, stood as testament that even the stoic Tiberius could engender delight. Yet Augustus harbored aspirations that demanded sacrifice. Augustus required strategic alliances. His daughter, Julia, needed a new consort following the demise of her previous husband. The solution was apparent: compel Tiberius to relinquish his cherished wife and forge a connection with direct imperial lineage. The directives arrived cloaked in pronouncements of duty and destiny. Tiberius resisted until such defiance constituted treason. The divorce proceedings unfolded with ruthless efficiency. One day, Vipsania was his wife. The next, she belonged to another senator. Roman jurisprudence was precise in such matters, though Roman hearts were considerably more complex. Servants reported encountering Tiberius lingering near Vipsania's new abode at unusual hours. On one occasion, he followed her through the forum, maintaining a discreet distance, yet never losing sight of her. When she finally turned and perceived him, observers recounted that she fled. He remained motionless, watching her vanish into the throng. The wedding night would establish a precedent for cruelty. Julia was the antithesis of Vipsania, sharp where Vipsania had been gentle, callous where Vipsania had been kind. She, too, had been coerced into this matrimonial arrangement. However, unlike Tiberius, she opted for retribution over sorrow. Their wedding night devolved into a conflict. She derided his hesitant advances, his awkward attempts at intimacy. He responded with a silence that deepened with each succeeding day. The marital chamber became a nightly humiliation. Julia openly entertained paramours, ensuring Tiberius was privy to every detail. She returned from clandestine encounters adorned with gifts from other men, eloquently describing their superior prowess in intimate matters. Tiberius endured, but an internal alteration began to take root. His attendants were the first to discern the shift. Where he had once been merely stern, he now exhibited unpredictability. A slave who inadvertently spilled wine might be met with clemency or receive 50 lashes. The decision seemed contingent upon whether Tiberius had encountered Vipsania that particular day. His renowned self-restraint faltered, revealing a sharp undercurrent. Military dispatches from this era depict a commander growing increasingly ruthless. Foes who had previously been granted honorable terminations now faced inventive forms of punishment. A Germanic chieftain who had surrendered in anticipation of clemency was forced to witness the execution of his entire family before meeting his own end. The general who had once inspired devotion through impartiality now governed through dread. Yet this marked only the initial soul Tiberius would forfeit. The metamorphosis accelerated with each passing month. He commenced excessive imbibing, a behavior alien to the abstemious soldier he had once been. Wine rendered the nights with Julia more tolerable, but it also engendered darker contemplations. He began compiling inventories, enumerating individuals who had offended him. Grievances, whether actual or imagined, were meticulously recorded with disturbing precision. Physical brutality infiltrated the marriage, not the overt kind that attracts attention, but calculated acts of harshness. Julia's servants whispered of peculiar penalties for minor transgressions. A coiffeuse who tugged too forcefully discovered her fingers systematically broken. A cupbearer who served wine with excessive delay was compelled to stand holding full goblets until his limbs gave way, whereupon he was beaten for any spillage. Throughout these ordeavers, Tiberius persisted in his vigils outside Vipsania's domicile. Her new husband lodged formal complaints with the magistrates, but who would dare apprehend Augustus's son-in-law? The surveillance continued, a stark reminder that power could seize everything save obsession. If the loss of love had inflicted a wound, the loss of blood would now pour venom into it, and mortality was already charting a course toward his son. The messenger's pronouncement struck with physical force. "Your son is deceased, Caesar. The physicians suspect poison." Drusus, son of Tiberius Claudius Nero, had been the sole positive outcome of Tiberius's union with Julia. Young, charismatic, possessing all that his father lacked. Drusus had been meticulously prepared for succession to the imperial throne. At 23 years of age, he commanded legions with innate ease. At 23 years of age, he died writhing in agony as his internal organs failed. The death mask captured his final expression, his mouth contorted, his eyes distended. Poison was certain, the perpetrator remained elusive. Tiberius's sorrow immediately transmuted into fury. If affection for Vipsania had been his anchor to humanity, affection for Drusus had been his final tether to sanity. That tether snapped with an almost audible sound. However, the death mask revealed something more sinister than mere homicide. The physicians examined the body with mounting alarm. This was no ordinary toxin. Its effects were too specific, too malevolent. Someone possessing profound knowledge had engineered Drusus's demise to maximize suffering, ensuring he would comprehend his dying moments, allowing him time for agonizing reflection. Tiberius absorbed this revelation in silence. Those present observed that his countenance remained impassive, yet his hands clenched with such ferocity that blood dripped from where his fingernails pierced his palms. When he finally articulated words, his voice was measured, Bring me all who had access to my son's sustenance and beverages. The inquiry commenced that very night. It was not the calculated Roman justice of trials and evidence, but something more ancient and sinister. Tiberius personally interrogated each suspect. The inquiries began with conventional questions regarding movements, alibis, and motives. Then they grew peculiar. He sought to understand their dreams, their childhood anxieties, their beliefs regarding post-mortem retribution. The roster of suspects swelled daily, inscribed in Tiberius's own hand. A wine steward present at Drusus's final repast. The physician who had failed to preserve his life. A senator who had engaged in disputes with Drusus over grain distribution. Julia's freed woman observed in proximity to the kitchens. The list expanded beyond any rational framework. Anyone who might have profited from Drusus's death. Anyone who had ever opposed him. Anyone who had merely been present. Tiberius devised classifications. Confirmed guilt, probable culpability, potential involvement. Guilt by association. The executions commenced with the first category, but did not terminate there. Roman law mandated proof, but grief demanded retribution, and Tiberius had discovered which imperative held greater sway. The wine steward perished first, subjected to crucifixion, albeit modified. Tiberius decreed that the crossbeam be positioned just low enough for the man's toes to graze the earth, thereby prolonging his torment for days. The physician received poison, yet diluted to replicate Drusus's agonizingly slow demise. Each execution was meticulously crafted, individualized, a signature of calculated vengeance. What he inflicted upon the physician's family would establish his modus operandi. The physician possessed a spouse and 3 offspring. Roman law stipulated that families were not liable for the transgressions of individuals. Tiberius, however, unearthed ingenious interpretations. The wife was accused of failing to report her husband's suspicious activities, a capital offense if proven. The eldest son, scarcely 16 years of age, was charged with conspiracy through silence. The 2 younger children presented a legal quandary. Roman law prohibited the execution of children below the age of puberty. Tiberius consulted arcane precedents until he unearthed obscure references to corruption of blood, the notion that treason contaminated entire familial lines. He ordered the children confined until they reached adulthood, whereupon they would be executed for inherited culpability. However, the interim proved unbearable. Each day the children lived felt like a mockery of Drusus's demise. Tiberius devised an alternative resolution. If they could not be legally put to death as minors, they need not remain minors. He mandated forced ceremonies, proclaiming them adults, and then ordered their strangulation on the same day. The pattern was established. Subsequent victims would learn that Tiberius's vengeance extended beyond individuals to encompass all those they held dear. Guilt by consanguinity, by marital ties, by companionship, by mere propinquity. The empire observed in horror as sorrow metastasized into systematic cruelty. Within months, Tiberius arrived at a determination that would transform an empire into a penitentiary. He was departing Rome indefinitely. The architect's hands trembled as Tiberius elucidated the precise specifications for the 12 planned villas. Capri had been selected with chilling deliberation. An island fortress accessible solely by sea, bordered by precipices plunging directly into deep waters. No unforeseen threats could breach its defenses. No assassins could approach undetected. More crucially, no witnesses could readily escape. The architect, a Syrian named Kellers, had erected edifices across the empire. Nothing in his experience had prepared him for Tiberius's requirements. 12 villas, each designated for a distinct function, concealed passages interconnecting them, chambers equipped with floor drains, pools of varying depths featuring elevated observation platforms, rooms fitted with ceiling hooks and wall-mounted restraints. "I require solitude," Tiberius articulated, his ravaged visage partially obscured by shadow. "Absolute seclusion." Villa number 3 contained pools unlike any found in Rome. These pools were not intended for aquatic recreation. Their dimensions were precisely calibrated, deep enough that an adult could not touch the bottom, yet shallow enough that activities within remained visible from above. Heating apparatuses maintained the water at specific temperatures. Submerged seating arrangements were carved into the sides at calculated elevations. Kellers posed no inquiries. He had learned that inquisitiveness in Tiberius's presence invariably led to an individual's disappearance. He constructed precisely as instructed, striving to avoid contemplating their intended purpose. His laborers, conscripted from across the empire to prevent any single faction from grasping the overall design, completed their assigned sections and were immediately dispatched elsewhere. Other villas served diverse objectives. Villa 7 housed diminutive chambers, each soundproofed with substantial walls and cork lining. Villa 9 contained medical facilities that appeared disproportionate for a private residence, equipped with examination tables fitted with restraints, an array of surgical implements, and containers for storing various bodily fluids. Ships arrived under the cloak of night, their cargo moving in complete silence. The initial vessels transported provisions and domestic staff. The servants selected were unusual, young, comely, chosen for attributes extending beyond typical household competencies. They hailed from remote provinces, regions where Latin was sparsely spoken and where families would not inquire about children who never returned. Subsequent shipments conveyed different cargo, bundled packages that exhibited occasional movement, crates fitted with air vents. Guards accompanied these consignments, men who had served in the Germanic campaigns and had learned to obey orders without introspection. The construction spanned 2 years. By the time Kellers concluded his work, Capri had evolved into an autonomous enclave, answerable solely to Tiberius. Supply chains were established, with sustenance, wine, and other necessities arriving weekly. What departed the island consisted predominantly of correspondence, imperial decrees that grew increasingly aberrant and cruel with each passing month. Yet, architectural design was merely the genesis of his innovations. Tiberius assembled a retinue unparalleled in Roman history. While typical emperors surrounded themselves with advisors and administrators, he sought out specialized expertise. There was Caracals, a physician previously ostracized from Rhodes for unconventional experimentation. Nerva, a legal scholar whose focus was the exploitation of legislative loopholes. Acelius, who had managed the empire's most exclusive brothel before accusations of extreme practices forced him into obscurity. These individuals formed Tiberius's inner circle, each contributing specialized knowledge to the emperor's evolving predilections. They convened for nocturnal repasts, their discourse spanning philosophy to depravity with equal intellectual rigor. Visitors reported an atmosphere of scholarly corruption, where unspeakable acts were discussed with the same detached objectivity as matters of grain importation. The court attracted others drawn to the darker aspects of human nature. Minor nobles ostracized for their appetites, merchants specializing in particular categories of enslaved individuals, artists who excelled at capturing moments of human extremity. Capri became a magnet for the empire's most illicit impulses, all shielded by imperial decree. When the initial cries echoed across Capri's precipices, even the guards who believed they had witnessed the utmost barbarity in Germania's conflicts discovered they were mistaken. The advertisement for a slave's position was unprecedented in Roman marketplaces, soliciting swimming instructors for imperial aquatic facilities with a preference for children. The recruitment occurred discreetly within the empire's most impoverished districts. Families burdened by excessive progeny were approached by well-dressed intermediaries. The proposition appeared exceptionally generous. Their offspring would serve within the emperor's household, acquiring valuable skills while remitting funds to their families. Parents who evinced excessive curiosity found the offers rescinded. Those who consented never saw their children again. The chosen children, predominantly between the ages of 6 and 10, were transported to Capri in covered conveyances and sealed vessels. They arrived disoriented but hopeful. Many had never beheld the sea before, nor envisioned such affluence. The villa's opulent marble halls and laden tables seemed like materialized dreams. The training commenced with rudimentary swimming instruction, yet the pool instructors exhibited initial patience. Children needed to acclimate to the water, to associate it with amusement rather than apprehension. They learned to suspend their respiration, to navigate gracefully beneath the surface, and to swim between adult legs without disrupting their rhythm. Rewards were bestowed upon those who progressed rapidly. Delectable confections, comfortable sleeping arrangements, and assurances of eventual prosperity. Gradually, the lessons assumed a more specific character. Children were instructed to nibble delicately, akin to the small aquatic creatures that cleansed larger specimens in natural pools. Initially, they practiced on fruits, then on each other under vigilant supervision. Those who bit too forcefully were disciplined. Those who exhibited hesitation faced harsher penalties. The designation minnows emerged organically. Like schools of diminutive fish, the children learned to move in unison, responding to subtle cues. A hand gesture signified approach. A different gesture indicated retreat. They developed their own communication methods, glances and touches that conveyed moods, dangers, and opportunities. Parents who inquired about their children received only silence. Correspondence ceased after the initial month. Official responses to inquiries were perfunctory, assuring that the children were well, that training continued, and that further contact would impede their adjustment. Parents who persisted encountered additional difficulties. Tax assessments escalated, business permits were revoked. The implicit message was unequivocal. Further persistence would incur severe repercussions. Some parents attempted to reach Capri independently. None succeeded in passing the mainland ports. Those who vocalized their insistence too vociferously simply vanished, their names appended to the burgeoning rosters of individuals who had displeased the emperor's will. The remaining families learned to mourn in silence, speaking of their lost offspring in the past tense. On Capri, the children's transformation proceeded with mechanical precision. They were bestowed new appellations, predominantly marine creatures, identities that effaced their pasts. They resided collectively in dormitories contiguous to the pool complexes, their lives meticulously structured around training schedules and performance benchmarks. One boy attempted escape by diving deeply, unaware that the pools had been engineered not to facilitate, but to preclude egress. The boy, designated Octopus, formerly Marcus from Brundisium, believed he could hold his breath sufficiently long to traverse the underwater conduits. He was unaware that these passages led to nowhere, that the apparent exits were illusory creations of ingenious architecture. They discovered him hours later, his lungs filled with water, still clawing at solid stone he had mistaken for liberation. Tiberius ordered the corpse displayed to the other minnows as an educational exhibit. The lesson was starkly simple. Escape was impossible save through absolute capitulation. Even death required authorization. The psychological conditioning intensified following each escape attempt. Children were indoctrinated with the notion that their families had bartered them, that the external world had disavowed them, and that only Tiberius's clemency spared them from dire fates. They learned to express gratitude for their circumstances, to vie for approval, and to inform on one another's doubts. Yet the pools represented only one venue of terror. Tiberius had discovered that fear itself could be weaponized across an entire populace. Marcus Calvus had been impoverished yesterday. Today, after uttering 5 words to a magistrate, he possessed his neighbor's villa. The 5 words were, he uttered an imprecation against the emperor's name. Whether this statement was factual or fabricated held less consequence than the accusation itself. Under Tiberius's new statutes, disparaging the emperor constituted treason. Failing to report such utterances rendered one complicit. Suspecting such thoughts without initiating an inquiry constituted negligence. The entire empire became an intricate web of potential culpability. The delator system revolutionized Roman society within months. Professional informers emerged from every stratum. Bankrupt merchants seeking new beginnings, ambitious freedmen aspiring to citizenship, senators intent on eliminating rivals. Information transformed into a commodity more valuable than precious metal, and everyone possessed something to offer. Marcus Calvus exemplified this new paradigm. A defunct pottery merchant, he had unearthed his aptitude for recalling conversations, imbuing innocuous remarks with sinister undertones. His inaugural success materialized serendipitously when he reported a customer's complaint regarding taxation as seditious discourse. The customer's execution yielded Marcus a percentage of the confiscated assets. The formula was uncomplicated. Accusation plus execution equals profit. The calculus of terror was publicly disseminated. Successful informers received 1/4 of convicted traitors' estates. In instances of exceptional wealth, even that fraction could establish dynastic fortunes. The imperial treasury appropriated another 1/4, funding subsequent investigations. The remaining half was allocated to public works, rendering every citizen complicit in the system's remuneration. Competition among delators intensified dramatically. Mere accusations were no longer sufficient. Evidence was fabricated. Conversations were invented. Documents were forged with escalating sophistication. Informers employed actors to befriend targets, extracting compromising statements through meticulously orchestrated scenarios. The most proficient cultivated specializations. One focused on interpreting dreams as treasonous prophecies. Another analyzed facial expressions during public readings of imperial edicts. A third claimed an ability to detect seditious thoughts through pulse examination. The inherent absurdity held less significance than the outcomes, and the outcomes invariably meant executions. Children learned to eavesdrop, understanding that words possessed monetary value. The corruption of youth arguably constituted the system's most profound horror. Parents instructed their offspring to meticulously recall dinner conversations, to report any unusual phrasing or suspicious silences. Educational institutions incorporated loyalty exercises, wherein students practiced identifying treasonous statements in hypothetical situations. Families fractured from within. Siblings denounced their brothers for hereditary shares. Wives lodged accusations against their husbands to extricate themselves from unsatisfying unions. Children pledged rewards and safeguards in exchange for testimony. They bore witness against their parents, who imposed excessively stern discipline. The psychological toll disseminated like a virulent epidemic. Trust became an impossibility when any confidence could be converted into incriminating evidence. Friendships withered as social interactions carried a perilous risk. Even one's thoughts seemed fraught with danger, as though Tiberius's operatives could decipher minds through scrupulous observation of conduct. However, certain accusations demanded more than mere words as validation. Tangible evidence held greater sway in judicial proceedings, prompting increasingly ingenious fabrications. Letters were expertly forged, with a skill that would impress contemporary transgressors. Simulated meetings were orchestrated using lookalikes and disguises. Innocent articles, a corroded blade, foreign coinage, rosters of names were planted to imply sedition. One informant, Fulcinius, honed the practice of attributing treason retrospectively. He would identify recently deceased individuals and subsequently unearth evidence of conspiracies they had purportedly hatched during their lives. The departed could not mount a defense, and their estates were forfeited regardless. Families forfeited all their possessions due to accusations leveled against phantoms. This system perpetuated itself through the cold calculus of fear. An increase in denunciations led to more capital punishments, which in turn yielded more confiscated property for redistribution, thereby attracting a greater number of informants. Tiberius fostered this cycle, viewing it as the pinnacle of effective administration, with the empire policing itself while simultaneously financing its endeavors through confiscation. When the very fabric of law transformed into an instrument of torment, Tiberius's magistrates discovered how to elevate execution into an art form, commencing its grim proceedings long before the ultimate moment of demise. The scribe dipped his quill and inscribed the new protocol. The execution of virgins necessitated preparatory measures to ensure statutory adherence. Ancient Roman jurisprudence incorporated a safeguard that even Tiberius initially found insurmountable. Virgins were exempt from capital punishment. This prohibition dated back to the Republic's inception, stemming from sacred beliefs concerning purity and divine equity. For a sovereign intent on eradicating entire familial lineages, this presented an unacceptable impediment. The solution materialized during the prosecution of Caenus's family. His young daughter, scarcely 12 years of age, was condemned for her father's betrayal. When the magistrates hesitated to execute an unblemished child, Tiberius's legal counsel discovered a precedent within military law. Adversaries of Rome forfeited all protections, encompassing those of the innocent. The executioner received explicit directives. Prior to the legal administration of strangulation, the girl's virgin status had to be nullified. What ensued established a paradigm that would shadow Roman justice for successive generations. The law was satisfied through flagrant brutality. Technical compliance was achieved through acts that fundamentally undermined the very essence of justice. The legal codices expanded to encompass novel interpretations. Tiberius's legal scholars labored assiduously to seal every potential avenue that might permit leniency. Age stipulations were subjected to reinterpretation. If an individual possessed the capacity to ambulate and articulate, they were deemed capable of committing treason. Exclusions based on mental faculties evaporated. Insanity became indicative of divine retribution for concealed transgressions. Particularly inventive was the broadening of culpability through association. Conventional Roman law held individuals accountable for their personal actions. Under Tiberius's reign, responsibility became communicable. Slaves faced execution for the transgressions of their masters. Dinner guests were condemned for failing to denounce seditious conversation during meals. Physicians risked death for ministering to individuals accused of sedition. The notion of constructive treason emerged, encompassing actions innocuous in themselves, but potentially leading to subversion. Diviners who prognosticated imperial fatalities, even those occurring centuries hence, were executed for fostering patience among supposed conspirators. Chroniclers who documented past acts of tyrannicide were eliminated for providing instructional frameworks. Magistrates vied to devise inventive applications. The judicial apparatus devolved into a macabre contest of ingenuity. Judge Vibius Serenus pioneered preemptive execution, dispatching individuals predicted to commit future offenses based on personality evaluations. Judge Cotomelianus developed the concept of inherited intent, wherein children inherited not merely their parents' guilt, but also their presumed motivations. Torture, traditionally employed to elicit confessions, became standard procedure for witnesses. The rationale was perverse yet consistent. Only agony could surmount the innate reluctance to betray comrades. Those who confessed swiftly were suspected of prearranged falsehoods. Those who resisted were deemed guilty of concealment. Every response served to justify an escalation. Legal proceedings transformed into theatrical spectacles. Accusers retained orators to amplify accusations with emotive pleas. Evidence was presented in ascending order of horror, culminating in crescendos that rendered verdicts unavoidable. Defense counsel, when permitted, faced execution themselves for advocating too fervently on behalf of their clients. One judge's innovation would plague families for generations. Judge Macro instituted sequential justice, executing family members according to their degree of emotional attachment. Distant relatives perished first, their demises employed to coerce closer kin into confessions. Parents witnessed their offspring's deaths to safeguard their spouses, only to be executed themselves for the original offense, plus the added charge of permitting family members to perish in their stead. The records of these proceedings, preserved within the imperial archives, read like treatises on sadism cloaked in legal terminology. Each innovation was meticulously documented, establishing precedents for future utilization. What commenced as extraordinary measures evolved into established practice, codified into law that outlasted its originator. The bureaucratization of atrocity necessitated an extensive administrative framework. Scribes specialized in meticulously tracing familial connections to ensure no relative evaded consequence. Archives housed detailed records of social networks, who dined with whom, marital unions, familial branches, and shared business interests. The informational infrastructure underpinning these legal barbarities grew more sophisticated than any contemporary surveillance state. Yet, the most profound tortures were not physical. Tiberius had mastered the art of extinguishing hope itself, weaponizing clemency into the cruelest instrument. The condemned prisoner would collapse with relief upon hearing of a reprieve, unaware they had just entered the most harrowing phase of their ordeal. Lucius Orontius had languished for 6 months in the Mamertine prison, awaiting execution for fabricated conspiracies. The cell's darkness had become familiar, its vermin almost companions compared to human visitors. When the guards announced Tiberius's merciful clemency, the dropping of charges, and his granted freedom, Lucius wept with a joy he believed irrevocably lost. The sunlight, after months of gloom, caused him discomfort. Rome's thoroughfares appeared impossibly boisterous and brilliantly illuminated. His wife collapsed when he appeared at their threshold, pale and emaciated like a spectre, yet alive. The children he had assumed he would never again behold clung to his legs. For 3 idyllic days, life reverted to its accustomed rhythms. On the 4th morning, soldiers reappeared. New evidence had surfaced. The clemency was rescinded. As they dragged Lucius back to incarceration, his wife's shrieks echoed those of countless others who had learned Tiberius's favored amusement. 3 days of liberty were worth far more anguish than 3 years of confinement. The psychological torment of disingenuous mercy surpassed physical suffering through its sheer precision. Prisoners were meticulously studied to ascertain their most cherished values: familial reunions, favorite comestibles, the simple warmth of sunlight. Reprieves were meticulously crafted to restore precisely these elements before their abrupt withdrawal. The stark contrast amplified suffering exponentially. Some prisoners experienced multiple reprieves. The record holder, a senator named Gaius Silius, was liberated and apprehended 7 times over a span of 2 years. Each release was timed with flawless accuracy, lasting just long enough to foster the belief that the nightmare had concluded, yet too brief to permit genuine recovery. His eventual execution brought a sense of relief to all, including himself. The system's barbarity lay in its inherent unpredictability. Some reprieves lasted mere hours, while others extended for months. Prisoners were never certain whether their freedom was genuine or merely another maneuver in Tiberius's cruel game. They could neither fully embrace elation nor wholly succumb to despair. They existed in a state of perpetual emotional twilight. Some inmates implored for death prior to their second reprieve. Marcus Lepidus attempted self-immolation rather than endure another cycle. Guards intervened, resuscitated him, and then announced his next temporary liberty. He spent this period in a state of catatonic dread, incapable of speech or movement, awaiting the inevitable reversal. When it transpired, witnesses reported him smiling for the first time in years. The dispensations of mercy fractured families as effectively as executions. Wives who had mourned their husbands were compelled to unmourn them, only to mourn anew. Children grew bewildered about their father's status, living or deceased, and developed a fear of bonding with someone who might vanish once more. The emotional whiplash engendered intergenerational trauma. Even more insidious were conditional reprieves. Your liberty hinges on your brother's confession. You shall live only as long as your son remains steadfast. Prisoners were released into mazes of insurmountable prerequisites, acutely aware that their recall could occur at any moment. They became unwilling instruments of their own torment. The system proved so remarkably effective that subsequent emperors adopted its methodologies. Tiberius documented his techniques with a disquieting sense of pride. Correspondence to provincial governors detailed optimal temporal sequencing for maximum psychological impact. charts meticulously tracked emotional breaking points across diverse personality profiles. The science of feigned mercy became another Roman innovation disseminated throughout the empire. Some individuals developed a form of immunity through madness. They greeted each reprieve with indifference and each subsequent arrest with equal equanimity. These shattered souls frustrated Tiberius as suffering necessitated consciousness and madness offered an escape. He consequently ordered physicians to preserve prisoners' sanity through careful ministrations, thereby safeguarding their capacity for pain. The false clemency apparatus spawned its own economy. Families disbursed fortunes for intelligence regarding reprieve schedules. Guards bartered hints about their duration. A clandestine marketplace emerged for emotional preparedness. Philosophers imparted techniques for enduring the annihilation of hope. Physicians prescribed herbal remedies to dampen anticipation. As minds across the empire fractured, Tiberius's own physical form began to mirror the internal decay, and mirrors became his most formidable adversaries. The physician recoiled as pustules erupted beneath his touch. The emperor's countenance wept pus that no unguent could staunch. The physical disintegration had commenced subtly, manifesting as a persistent dermatological irritation, intermittent boils, and skin that failed to heal properly. Court physicians initially attributed these afflictions to diet, stress, or the island's oppressive humidity. They administered treatments effective for ordinary individuals. However, Tiberius had long transcended normalcy, and his body appeared determined to make this truth manifest. By his 70th year, the corruption was undeniable. Suppurating sores encrusted his face and scalp, weeping incessantly despite all medical interventions. An offensive odor, reminiscent of decaying flesh mingled with the failed attempts at perfumed concealment, preceded him through the villa's corridors. Servants learned to respire through their mouths in his presence. The irony was not lost on anyone. The man who proclaimed himself a deity was decomposing while still alive. Priests compelled to venerate his divine status now struggled to suppress nausea during ceremonies. The dichotomy between imperial propaganda and physical reality became Rome's most profound jest. Each new affliction seemed to spawn fresh cruelties. The correlation between corporeal deterioration and moral depravity was too conspicuous to disregard. As Tiberius's physical being failed, his intellect compensated with increasingly elaborate forms of torture. Days marked by aggravated sores witnessed the highest number of executions. Physicians monitored exacerbations as if tracking meteorological patterns, issuing warnings to staff when eruptions presaged violence. He prohibited mirrors throughout Capri after encountering his own reflection. The burnished bronze revealed the truth too starkly. The divine Augustus's successor reduced to a walking contagion. Servants who inadvertently exposed reflective surfaces were subjected to flogging. One woman perished for wearing ornamentation that too clearly displayed his likeness. Medical consultations devolved into surreal performances. Physicians examined the emperor while deliberately avoiding direct visual contact, diagnosing through peripheral vision and cautious palpation. They prescribed remedies they knew to be ineffectual, understanding that candor would result in their demise. This charade satisfied no one but persisted, as the alternative was considerably more dire. Servants who glimpsed his visage frequently vanished. The household staff developed elaborate protocols to circumvent direct observation of their master. They served him while walking backward, maintained their gaze fixed upon the floor, and donned specialized hoods that restricted their field of vision. Even accidental glimpses carried inherent risks. A maid who involuntarily gasped upon an unexpected sight was strangled within hours. Tiberius's anxieties regarding his appearance extended beyond mere vanity. He harbored the conviction that adversaries might employ his image in malevolent amulets and that accurate likenesses could channel occult assaults. Artists were forbidden from depicting him. Coins bore profiles from decades past. The empire was governed by a phantom of past grandeur, while present horrors remained undocumented. The physical suffering amplified his cruelty exponentially. Incapable of slumber due to his pain, he commissioned diversions derived from the agony of others. Nighttime executions became commonplace, their screams drowning out his own groans. He experimented with whether different categories of suffering might alleviate his own, treating human pain as a form of medicinal intervention. The stench preceded him like a harbinger of doom. Even in the open air, the Faetor announced Tiberius's approach minutes before his actual appearance. Gardens appeared to wither in his presence. Whether this was a consequence of reality or the servants' fearful imaginations remained unclear. Animals fled. The sea breeze, which ought to have purified Capri's atmosphere, seemed to intensify the pervasive corruption. Attempts at concealment grew increasingly desperate. Incense burners were carried ahead of imperial processions, creating smoke screens. Perfumes were blended in such potent concentrations that they caused eyes to sting and throats to burn. The remedy became an additional affliction. As courtiers choked on concoctions more noxious than the original ailment, the decay metaphorically permeated the court. Those in closest proximity to Tiberius developed their own maladies: rashes, boils, mysterious wasting illnesses. Whether transmitted through contagion or divine judgment, proximity to corruption bore a visible cost. The inner circle transformed into a collection of afflicted individuals. Yet, even as his body failed, Tiberius perfected one final innovation, rendering Capri's precipices Rome's most dreaded execution site. The soldier assigned to the cliff's base had requested the post, anticipating a facile duty until the initial casualty plummeted downwards. Centurion Marcus Flavius had served 20 years in the legions, having survived the Germanic forests and the Parthian deserts. He envisioned Capri as a period of tranquil retirement, involving simple guard responsibilities. The recruitment officer had neglected to mention the cliff or the true nature of his impending duties. The location was ideally suited for its intended purpose: a sheer descent of 300 feet onto jagged rock formations, with deep waters beyond to carry away the remains, negating the need for trials or formal execution procedures, merely a shove and the inexorable force of gravity. Tiberius had discovered a method of achieving efficiency through geography, transforming natural topography into an executioner. Marcus's assignment was straightforward in description, yet horrific in execution. He was to await at the base with a specially designed hooked club. His task was to ensure that no one survived the fall. On occasion, some did survive, severely injured but breathing, pleading for mercy that could not be granted. His orders were explicit: complete what gravity had initiated. Some victims attempted to precipitate their own demise before being pushed. However, the cliff's perimeter was vigilantly maintained. Guards were trained to discern subtle shifts in body language, to anticipate the precise moment when despair transmuted into desperate action. They would surge forward, restraining individuals who sought to dictate their final moments. Even the autonomy over their timing of death was denied. The forced marches to the precipice became spectacles of dread. Victims were compelled to progress at a deliberate pace, affording them ample opportunity to contemplate the approaching edge. Some were deluded with the notion they were being transported to vessels for exile, sustaining their hopes until the final turn revealed the grim reality. Others understood their fate from the outset, a comprehension that rendered the journey all the more agonizing. Groups were frequently subjected to joint executions, particularly if they were suspected of conspiratorial alliances. At times, selections were made randomly to fulfill quotas. They were made to witness each preceding individual's fall, meticulously counting down their own impending moments. Children observed their parents plummeting. Husbands watched their wives being propelled over the edge. The deliberate multiplication of psychological torment was intentional. The rocks below became permanently stained a deep crimson. No amount of tidal washing could cleanse the accumulated carnage. The stones acquired rusty hues that persisted throughout the changing seasons. Fishermen avoided the waters, reporting that their nets became entangled with ghastly remains. Birds that frequented the area were considered accursed, their flesh tainted by their consumption. Marcus Flavius meticulously maintained a personal tally initially, inscribing faint marks upon his shield. After the 100th casualty, he ceased counting but could not eradicate the recollections. Faces haunted him, the young woman who offered a smile before leaping, the elderly man who invoked divine curses upon unheeding gods, the child who cried for his mother while descending. The cliff executions served multiple objectives beyond mere termination. They were visible from the sea, serving as a stark warning to approaching vessels regarding Capri's sinister nature. The cries carried across the water on still evenings, reaching mainland settlements as a grim reminder of imperial authority. Even remoteness offered no sanctuary from this pervasive awareness. One soldier persisted in his enumeration until the sheer volume overwhelmed him. Legionnaire Quintus possessed a keen aptitude for figures and took pride in his accuracy. He meticulously compiled detailed accounts, including names when ascertainable, descriptions when not, times of day, atmospheric conditions, and final utterances. His ledgers became compulsively comprehensive, as if such documentation might imbue meaning into utter meaninglessness. By his calculation, 847 individuals plunged over the cliff within his first year of service. This number fractured something within his psyche. He began to perceive them even while awake, falling eternally, yet never reaching the bottom. His barracks companions reported him conversing with empty space, offering apologies to spectral accusers. One morning, he was discovered at the cliff's base, having joined his meticulously compiled tally. The rotation of duty at the cliff subsequently changed. No soldier served longer than 1 month. Even this brief tenure proved excessive for some. Veterans of brutal military campaigns found themselves breaking under the weight of executing civilians. The passive nature of the killing, the mere act of standing by while gravity enacted its work, somehow proved more harrowing than the active violence of combat. 23 years of accumulated horror had so thoroughly corrupted the empire that Romans began to pray for something they had never previously desired: the emperor's demise. In hushed taverns across the empire, citizens whispered the same desperate query: is the monster finally perishing? By the year 36 AD, rumors of impending death had become Rome's preferred form of entertainment. Every cough reported from Capri sparked renewed hope. Every delay in communication suggested possibilities. Markets fluctuated in response to health reports. Grain prices declined when Tiberius appeared weakened and soared when he recovered. The empire's economy had become intrinsically linked to the mortality of a single individual. The prayers were universal, yet discreetly offered. Temples witnessed an increase in offerings to deities of death, though petitioners often cited other motivations. Cursed tablets were interred at crossroads, their lead surfaces etched with pleas for the emperor's demise. Even expressions of animosity had to be conveyed in coded language, given the omnipresent surveillance. Previous assassination attempts had concluded spectacularly. Each failure resulted in waves of executions, not solely of the conspirators, but also of anyone who exhibited insufficient horror at the attempts, rendering the celebration of survival a mandatory performance. Citizens practiced contorted expressions of shock in their mirrors, preparing for the announcement of yet another thwarted plot. However, each rumor of death proved fallacious, followed by punitive purges. The pattern was as predictable as the dawn. Reports of illness would circulate for days, growing more detailed with each retelling. Hope would escalate to perilous levels. Then Tiberius would reappear, very much alive and acutely aware of those who had prematurely rejoiced. Lists of names would follow, subsequently leading to arrests and executions. One particularly egregious incident involved the erroneous proclamation of his death by a compromised messenger. Celebrations erupted prior to confirmation. When Tiberius ultimately emerged, he permitted the festivities to continue for 3 days before revealing himself. The extensive purges saw hundreds eliminated for displaying joy too openly. The messenger's entire lineage was eradicated. The sheer emotional toll weakened even the most resilient individuals. Hope itself became a torment, perpetually rekindled only to be cruelly extinguished. Some citizens of Rome adopted a defensive pessimism, refusing to entertain any positive tidings. Others succumbed to the immense pressure of constant performance, unable to sustain the required display of grief over his continued existence. Certain Romans sought refuge by leaving, unwilling to endure another decade of such oppression. Voluntary departures escalated significantly during Tiberius's final years. Entire families divested their assets and vanished into frontier territories, preferring the company of so-called barbarians to the civilized terror they had left behind. Border settlements became inundated with individuals who chose the uncertainty of an unknown future over the grim certainty of eventual indictment. Those unable to flee devised their own methods of survival. Conversations became intricate tapestries of veiled meaning, each utterance meticulously crafted to deflect any interpretation as criticism. Public spaces grew deserted as social interaction posed a potentially fatal risk. Rome transformed into a city of hushed tones and lingering shadows. The network of informers adapted, mirroring the patterns of outward migration. Operatives specialized in tracking down fleeing families, monitoring financial transactions, and following property conveyances. The very act of leaving became construed as evidence of guilt. The empire's boundaries, meant to protect, became an intricate trap, ensnaring those seeking to escape the inescapable. Then, March of 37 AD arrived, and this time, the silence emanating from Capri was indeed genuine. The initial indication was a disruption in the established order. Supply vessels returned without receiving new directives. All communication attempts with the island went unanswered. The precise machinery of imperial governance ground to a halt. For once, silence might indeed signify what everyone desperately hoped for. Nevertheless, no one dared to celebrate. Previous instances of false alarms had taught them brutal lessons. Days elapsed in a state of suspense. Commerce slowed as Romans awaited confirmation. Even the informers hesitated to report seditious jubilation, recognizing that joy itself might be premature. Confirmation arrived indirectly. Funeral arrangements commenced in Rome before any official declaration. Someone significant had perished on Capri, someone whose passing warranted a state ceremony. Hope solidified into possibility, and possibility evolved into probability. Yet, public reaction remained subdued. 20 years of terror had conditioned the populace to suppress spontaneous emotions. On the morning of the 16th of March, a servant stealthily entered the emperor's private chambers, discovering what millions had ardently wished for. But had the nightmare truly concluded? The servant's sandals echoed softly against the marble as he approached the imperial bed. 3 days of unsettling silence had instilled sufficient courage for an investigation. The stench was the first sensation, a pervasive corruption underlying layers of perfume. It was the unmistakable mark of death, a scent no incense could effectively mask. Tiberius lay contorted within silken sheets, his gaze fixed upon some unseen horror on the ceiling, visible only to him. Flies crawled across those unblinking orbs, their incessant buzzing the sole sound in a room that had once resonated with screams. The countenance that had instilled fear throughout an empire was now merely a decaying mass. Sores still wept their venom into the fabric, destined to be incinerated rather than cleansed. The servant retreated with caution, as if the corpse might still issue a condemnation. In the corridor, he encountered others approaching with similar intent. They exchanged silent acknowledgments, their gazes confirming the grim reality. One individual rushed to summon the captain of the guard, another hurried to prepare signal fires. The remaining individuals stood frozen, uncertain how to process the corporeal demise of their tormentor. Word of the event cascaded through Capri's opulent residences like wildfire. Servants who had lived in perpetual apprehension for years stepped out into the light. Guards laid down their instruments of atrocity. Within the pools, where unspeakable acts had transpired, individuals began draining the water as if attempting to flush away pervasive evil. On the mainland, keen observers noticed the signal fires. "He is dead," someone whispered. "The emperor is deceased." The whisper escalated into a murmur, which swelled into a shout and finally erupted into a roar. 23 years of pent-up emotion burst forth simultaneously across the empire, reaching even the Tiber with the news of Tiberius's demise. The chant originated in Rome's most impoverished districts, the areas that had suffered the most victims. It propagated through marketplaces and public squares, accumulating voices like an avalanche, gathering snow. Senators, who had lived in fear for decades, suddenly found their courage bolstered by the collective will of the populace. Citizens who had denounced their neighbors now embraced in mutual absolution. The spontaneous celebrations that erupted defied any description. Wine flowed abundantly as tavern owners declared the emperor's death worth financial ruin. Musicians performed melodies that had been forbidden for decades. Dancers took to the streets, which had previously witnessed only processions of mourning. Rome resounded with laughter, tears, and shouts of relief. However, even amidst the jubilation, the damage remained evident. Children who had grown up under the shadow of terror struggled to comprehend the joy. Adults flinched from happiness, anticipating an inevitable reversal. 2 decades of ingrained conditioning could not be erased by a single deceased tyrant. The empire was liberated, but deeply scarred, set free but irrevocably altered. Officials engaged in heated deliberations regarding the disposition of the body. Traditional customs dictated a state funeral, complete with divine honors for the deceased emperor. Yet tradition had not accounted for Tiberius. Senators who had previously bestowed honors upon him while he lived now advocated for his treatment as a common criminal. The debate intensified as the corpse deteriorated. The clamor of the populace grew louder, demanding a reckoning with Tiberius at the Tiber. Historical precedents existed for dragging enemies of Rome through the streets and casting them into the river, but never an emperor, and certainly never one who had been declared divine. This profound contradiction paralyzed the government, while popular unrest filled the ensuing void. On Capri, even more disturbing discoveries emerged. The pools yielded their grim secrets, small bones that spoke silent, horrifying narratives. Concealed chambers revealed instruments of peculiar design. Archives contained lists of victims spanning decades, names meticulously crossed out with mechanical precision. The island itself seemed imbued with malevolence, as if wickedness had seeped into its very stones. Survivors began to emerge from their hidden sanctuaries. Children who had once been vulnerable youngsters, now adults, blinked in sunlight they had almost forgotten existed. Women held captive for unspecified purposes walked free, their legs still unsteady from disuse. Each account of survival added a fresh layer of horror to Tiberius's legacy. The legal system confronted insurmountable challenges. How could the deceased be prosecuted? How could victims of imperial decrees be compensated? How could the apparatus of terror be dismantled without becoming a new form of terror itself? Every institution bore the indelible marks of corruption. Every legal text contained his injurious precedents. Some argued for oblivion, proposing the destruction of records, the abandonment of Capri, and a collective pretense that those decades had never occurred. Others insisted on meticulous documentation, asserting that such horror must be remembered to prevent its recurrence. This debate would persist across generations, with each era finding its own interpretations. Ultimately, practicality triumphed over symbolism. Tiberius received minimal rites, his ashes interred discreetly while Rome averted its gaze. The Tiber flowed onward, unburdened by the symbolic purification the crowds had demanded. Perhaps they understood that water could not wash away the stain of normalized atrocity. The vulnerable children were released, but their spirits remained captive, carrying memories that no passage of time could dilute. Families were reunited with the specters of children they had lost. Informers reinvented themselves, though their neighbors retained their memories. The structure of terror was dismantled, but its foundations remained embedded within Roman jurisprudence, awaiting future despots to build upon. Capri was left to the mercy of the wind and gulls. The villas crumbled, their specialized chambers succumbing to sand and silence. Fishermen claimed the island was cursed, with screams allegedly echoing on certain nights. Whether factual or embellished, these tales deterred visitors. Some places were too deeply tainted for redemption. History would remember Tiberius as the emperor who perverted power into unimaginable patterns. However, the more profound horror may have been Rome's remarkable capacity for adaptation, the swift integration of atrocity into administrative routine. The propensity for evil had not vanished with him. It had merely lost its most fervent exponent. Successive emperors would study his methodologies, some with revulsion, others with keen interest. The precedents he established, legal torture, systematic terror, industrialized cruelty would reverberate through the centuries. Rome had learned the dreadful potential when unchecked power intersected with pathology. This knowledge was indelible. As the fading light of the 16th of March yielded to dusk and the celebrations finally subsided, Rome confronted an unsettling truth. They had survived Tiberius, but their survival had necessitated adjustments that could not be easily discarded. The empire was free, yet freedom possessed a different savor after decades of pervasive fear. The Tiber continued its course, carrying the everyday detritus of life as it always had. No corpse polluted its waters, no dramatic act signified the end of evil. Only the slow, arduous process of recovery, the painstaking restoration of trust, and the hope that future tyrants might be identified and thwarted before they could transform capable military leaders into figures of nightmarish consequence. Yet, somewhere within the empire, a young Caligula was observing, diligently learning from his predecessors' triumphs and failures. The monster was deceased, but monstrosity had proven its viability. Rome would confront this lesson repeatedly, until the very concept of empire served as history's cautionary tale regarding the corrupting influence of absolute power. The servant who discovered Tiberius's lifeless body never recounted what he witnessed in those vacant eyes. Some speculated fear, others surprise. The majority agreed on a profound emptiness. Perhaps, in the end, this was Tiberius's ultimate punishment. Dying as he had lived, alone with the horror of his own making, finally compelled to confront himself without the solace of mirrors or the possibility of mercy.